They were just days away from the miracle. The manna was still fresh in his memory. The sea was still open in history. But one question still echoes today. What if the people had entered the promised land on their first try? It wasn't for lack of promises. It wasn't a lack of power. It was excessive fear. Because the earth was good. But their eyes were fixed on the giants. Today, this story is not about Israel. It talks about spiritual setbacks. About open doors that were never crossed. Regarding promises delayed by disbelief. If this message speaks to you, leave a like now. This helps the channel reach more people who are also standing at the door of the promise. And sign up. Because this word can unlock decisions you've been putting off for years. Now, take a deep breath. Because this story might explain why some promises take so long to be fulfilled. Before fear took shape, before any giant was described, before doubt found a voice among the people, the promise already existed. God doesn't begin this story with a threat. He begins with a clear, direct, and irrevocable declaration. Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, the land I am giving to the Israelites. This is not a hypothesis. It is not a test. It is a foretold delivery. The promised land was not in dispute. It already had a defined owner. Sending the spies was not to decide whether to enter, but to show what was already reserved. Here a principle is born that transcends generations. God does not reveal destinies to provoke anxiety. He reveals them to generate movement. The order to spy does not stem from God's insecurity, but from divine pedagogy. He was teaching the people to align vision with promise. The problem is that they brought natural eyes to a spiritual calling. And when that happens, the promise begins to be measured by fear. It's important to understand the context. Israel wasn't weak. They had seen the sea part. They had walked between walls of water. They had eaten bread that fell from the sky. They had survived the impossible. Even so, as they approach the promise, something changes. The faith that worked in Egypt now seems small in the face of Canaan. Because liberation requires momentary faith. But conquest requires sustained faith. This is the first major shock in this narrative. God had already done the hardest part. But the people stumble at the next step. Not because the promise was too great, but because they began to question whether they were capable of sustaining it. And here lies one of the greatest spiritual deceptions. God never calls someone because they are capable. He calls because He has chosen to empower them. The earth didn't demand self-confidence. It demanded continuous trust in God. The text makes it clear that all the leaders were chosen. One from each tribe. Respected men. Influential men. This teaches us something dangerous. Position does not guarantee spiritual vision. Leadership does not prevent fear. Mature people can still misinterpret the promise if they allow faith to be replaced by human logic. They did not doubt the fertility of the land. They doubted God's faithfulness in leading them there. And here the script begins to tug at the viewer's heartstrings. How many times has God shown the destination, confirmed the promise, opened impossible paths? But fear arose precisely when everything was about to be fulfilled. Because there is a silent spiritual pattern. The most intense attack of fear doesn't come at the beginning of the journey. It comes when the promise is too close to be ignored. The land was good. That was never in doubt. The problem wasn't Canaan. It was the comparison. When the people begin to see themselves as small, the promise starts to seem too big. When identity is lost, even what God promised begins to frighten. They didn't forget who God was. They forgot who they were in God. This first part of the chapter is a mirror for anyone facing a decision. God has already spoken. The path has already been shown. The confirmation has already come. But there is still a pause. A waiting period. A tense silence before the final answer. It is in this space that faith is tested. Not by the absence of a promise, but by the presence of fear. And here is the question that keeps the debate alive. If God has already declared the land as given, what could prevent entry? It wasn't the giants. It wasn't the walls. It wasn't the armies. It was something invisible. A distorted lens. A heart divided between the promise and the memory of the desert. The greatest risk wasn't dying trying to enter. It was living forever circling around what had already been promised. 40 days later, they return.
And this return marks the exact point where destiny begins to diverge.
There was no change in the land. There was no change in the promise. What changed was the narrative.
Because when 12 men return from Canaan, they bring not only fruit in their hands,
they bring interpretations in their hearts. And interpretations build futures. Everyone saw the same landscape,
the same fortified cities,
the same fertile fields, the same giant grapes, the same soil that confirmed everything God had said.
The land truly flowed with milk and honey. Up to this point, there is no conflict. The problem arises in the next sentence.
They begin to talk about the inhabitants.
And it is at this point that the focus shifts. When the eyes leave the promise and fix on the obstacles, faith begins to lose ground.
10 of them decide to tell the story from the perspective of fear. They don't deny the land's goodness, but they add a burden that God never placed upon it. They say the people are too strong, the cities are too big, the giants are too tall. And without realizing it, they shift the focus of the conversation. They no longer talk about what God promised. Now they talk about what seems impossible.
Unbelief rarely presents itself as a direct denial of God's word.
It disguises itself as prudence. It seems like wisdom. It sounds like caution.
But at its core, it's fear dressed as a logical argument. Meanwhile, 2 men observe the same scene and see something else.
Caleb stands up. He interrupts the flow of fear. He says it's possible. He says they can go up and possess the land. Not because they are strong, but because the Lord is with them. This difference is crucial. Faith doesn't ignore giants. It simply refuses to place them above God. Joshua and Caleb didn't have less information. They had an interpretation aligned with the promise. Here the text reveals something profound. The land did not separate the people. The way of looking at things did.
The same environment produced courage in 2 and paralysis in 10. This confronts us directly.
The problem is not what you are experiencing. It is the meaning you give to what you are experiencing. 2 groups can go through the same crisis. One grows. The other retreats. It all depends on who is at the center of the vision. The 10 say something that sounds small, but is devastating.
In our eyes, we were like grasshoppers. This phrase reveals the root of all unbelief.
A diminished identity. They don't see themselves as the chosen people. They don't see themselves as bearers of the promise. They see themselves as victims. When someone sees themselves as small, any obstacle becomes gigantic. And when identity is lost, the promise begins to seem like a divine misjudgment. Joshua and Caleb see the same enemy force, but they interpret it differently.
For them, the inhabitants of the land are not a sign of defeat.
They are bread. They are proof that God has already given everything. Where some see a threat, others see confirmation. That is the difference between faith and unbelief. Faith reads the scenario in the light of who God is. Unbelief reads the scenario in the light of who they think they are. And here a silent hook is born that captivates the listener. If everyone saw the same land, why were only 2 ready to enter? Because the decision wasn't made in Canaan. It was made in the heart. Long before the report was given to the people. The future of Israel began to be decided not by giants, but by the words that would come from the mouths of those men. This moment teaches us something dangerous. Not every majority is right.
Sometimes, the loudest voice is the one most tainted by fear.
True faith almost always seems like a minority before it becomes history. And when God places a promise before someone, there will always be 2 narratives available. One that explains why it doesn't work, and one that declares why, despite everything, it is possible.
The chapter isn't over yet.
But destiny has already begun to be written. Not by the land, not by the enemies, but by the words chosen to describe them.
Because what you call a giant today may become the argument that defines where you will end up tomorrow.
Night falls over the camp, and with it, something far more dangerous than giants begins to spread. It is not an enemy army. It is a collective spirit of fear.
The text says that the entire congregation raises its voice and weeps. An entire generation is seized by an emotional reaction born from a distorted report.
Here occurs the most tragic turning point in the story. Fear ceases to be individual and becomes consensus. They don't cry because God failed. They cry because they chose to believe more in the word of men than in the word of God. The promise still echoed fresh. The land was still before them. But their minds had already returned to Egypt. When fear dominates the heart, the body may even be close to the promise, but the soul has already retreated. The people begin to murmur against Moses and Aaron. But the murmuring never stops with the visible leaders. It always goes through and reaches God. They say something that reveals spiritual collapse. It would have been better to die in Egypt or in this desert. This phrase is heavy, because the same God who delivered them from death is now accused of leading them to it. Unbelief does not deny the miracles of the past. It only devalues them when the present demands faith. Here arises one of the most terrifying moments in the narrative. The people decide to choose a new leader to return to Egypt. This is not just nostalgia. It is a rejection of identity. Egypt represented slavery, but it also represented predictability. The promise, on the other hand, demanded trust. And when the heart is dominated by fear, familiar slavery seems safer than unknown freedom. This is where spiritual backwardness begins. Not when people doubt in silence, but when they collectively voice their disbelief. Words create environments. Environments shape decisions. And collective decisions can delay entire destinies. An entire generation has allowed fear to become culture. And when fear becomes culture, even promises begin to seem like a threat. Joshua and Caleb tear their clothes. They are not acting. They are in spiritual despair. They try to wake the people. They remind them that the land is good, that the Lord is pleased with them, that the enemy has no protection. But now it is too late. The multitude has already chosen whom to believe. And this is one of the hardest lessons in the Bible. Truth does not always prevail when fear has already conquered the collective heart. The text reveals something profound. The people were not prevented from entering by God at that moment. They themselves closed the door. Unbelief does not need divine intervention to cause delay. It sustains itself. When someone decides not to trust, they automatically decide not to move forward. And where there is no progress, there is stagnation. And where there is stagnation, time begins to take its toll. This episode confronts us directly. How many decisions have been postponed not because God said no, but because fear said not yet? How many promises have been left for later because the opinion of the majority seemed safer than divine guidance? The problem wasn't crying. The problem was letting crying become the guide. Here's the hook that keeps the attention hooked. The promise hasn't been withdrawn yet. God hasn't spoken yet. But something irreversible began to happen that night. A delay began to take hold. Not for lack of power. Not for absence of God. But because a generation decided it preferred to survive in fear rather than live by faith. And that is the uncomfortable truth. The greatest enemy of the promised land was not in Canaan. It was in the midst of the camp. Invisible. Collective. Fueled by words. The people did not lose the promise that night. But they lost something just as serious. They lost the right to live it at the right time. Then God speaks. And when He speaks, the silence weighs more than the noise of the crowd. The weeping has ceased. The murmuring is silenced. Because now it is no longer human leaders on the scene. It is the Lord Himself responding to a collective decision. And what He says reveals a truth that few like to face. The promise has not been cancelled. But the process has been altered. God declares that He heard the people's murmuring. Every word. Every complaint. Nothing went unnoticed. That alone should be enough to make us tremble. Because often people murmur thinking it's just a venting of frustration. But in the kingdom, words are seeds. And seeds always produce something. What was planted there was not faith. It was unbelief. And the harvest could be nothing else. The Lord affirms that He will do as they have spoken. This is one of the most serious principles in all of Scripture. God respects choices. He does not force anyone to live out promises they do not wish to uphold by faith. The people said they would die in the desert. And God confirms that that generation would not enter the land. Not because He desired it, but because the decision had already been made in their hearts. Something profound happens here. God forgives. Moses intercedes. Full judgment is averted. But the consequences remain. This reveals a difference that few understand. Forgiveness is not synonymous with the absence of consequences. The relationship is restored. The path is not. The promise remains valid. But immediate access is closed to that generation. The text then reveals the invisible cost of spiritual delay. 40 days of spying become 40 years of pilgrimage. Each day of unbelief generates a year of waiting. Not because God is vengeful, but because the faith they refuse to learn quickly would now have to be learned slowly, in the desert. Time stretches when the heart refuses to trust. And the desert, which should only be a passage, becomes a dwelling place. The cloud still guides. The manna still falls. God does not abandon. But now there is no progress. Only maintenance. Survival. Routine. Walks that lead nowhere. This is one of the most dangerous states of spiritual life. When everything seems normal, but nothing is advancing. Generation after generation begins to die along the way. Not in battle. Not in confrontation with giants. They die walking in circles. The promise is there, within reach of memory, but outside of experience. And this reveals something painful. Not all delay is immediately visible. Sometimes it disguises itself as spiritual routine. Worship continues. Manna continues. Presence continues. But purpose is suspended. This passage from the narrative forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. God can be with us, and yet we may be out of sync with the timing. He can provide, protect, and guide, and still not allow progress. Because moving forward requires something that generation chose not to offer: trust. Herein lies a powerful hook for the listener. How many people are living in maintenance mode? They haven't returned to Egypt. But they haven't entered the land either. They're in the middle. Federal protected. But behind schedule. And often they think that's normal. God hasn't changed. The promise hasn't changed. What has changed is who would be alive to experience it. Spiritual backwardness doesn't just destroy opportunities. It changes generations. Children enter into promises that parents could have lived if they had trusted when they had the chance. And that's the most striking thing. The desert wasn't punishment. It was a consequence. A prolonged journey because faith was compromised at the decisive moment. The promised land remained ahead. But now, the price of fear would be paid in years. In repeated steps. In stories told about a promise that was almost fulfilled. While an entire generation learns to die in the desert, 2 men learn to wait without losing faith. The text makes a point of setting them apart from the rest. Joshua and Caleb are not spared from the desert, but they are preserved in their hearts. They walk the same miles. They eat the same manna. They drink the same water from the rock. But they carry something that time has not been able to erode: the conviction that God would still fulfill what He promised. This detail is powerful. God doesn't remove Joshua and Caleb from the process. He keeps them within it. Faithfulness doesn't exempt one from the difficult path, but it guarantees the final destination. They wait 40 years not because they doubted, but because they are part of a people. This reveals a mature truth. Sometimes, faithful people suffer delays because of collective decisions. Even so, God knows exactly who remained believing when everyone else retreated. The Lord declares that they will enter the earth because they had a different spirit. This expression is profound. It doesn't mean a different personality. It means aligned vision. They did not allow the fear of the majority to shape their decisions. They remained faithful when being faithful cost popularity, security, and applause. True faith almost always exacts a silent price before yielding visible reward. Decades pass. An entire generation falls. And then the day arrives. Joshua crosses the Jordan as a leader. Caleb, now elderly, asks for the land of the giants. He doesn't ask for rest. He asks for mountains. He asks for challenges. This reveals something extraordinary. The faith that was preserved in the desert did not age. On the contrary, it matured. Those who wait on God do not lose strength. They gain depth. This conclusion changes the lens on the entire story. The focus is not only on those who lagged behind. It's on those who persevered. God is never without witnesses. Even amidst collective disbelief, He preserves those who do not compromise on the promise. These people may seem like a minority for a time, but in the end,
They are the ones who overcome it.
Here arises the question that confronts the listener. Are you allowing the fear of others to dictate your pace? Or are you holding on to enough faith for when the door finally opens? Joshua and Caleb teach us that entering the promise is not about speed. It's about continuous faithfulness. The people who died in the desert saw miracles, but they did not experience their fulfillment. Joshua and Caleb saw delay, silence, and waiting, but they experienced what was promised. This reveals something that few realize. God does not reward momentary enthusiasm. He honors constancy. And then comes the inevitable end. The promised land was always there. The giants too. What determined who entered was not strength, nor age, nor time. It was the decision made when everyone had the same chance. Some chose to listen to fear. Others chose to trust in God. This story didn't end in Numbers. It repeats itself every day. Promises continue to be made. Doors continue to be opened. And people continue to stand before them, trying to decide which voice to trust. The voice of the majority, or the voice of God. The desert doesn't have to be the end. It can simply be a place of learning. But the decision remains the same. You can circle around the promise, telling stories about what you almost experienced. Or you can be one of those who keep the faith until the day they finally enter. Because in the kingdom, not everyone who sees the promise lives it. But everyone who trusts, sooner or later, crosses over.